No worries, Adina. Thank you. I do encourage people to, as long as you don't have background noise, do please use your microphone. And if you don't mind being on camera, do that too. I always feel like you want people to be able to let you know when you're wandering off into the weeds. So this is a case study I've been wanting to present for almost a decade now. It's a large case study. This is about the creation of a $9 billion channel for Australia's largest banking group. And it's a study I hesitated to give because I always worry that when things are fresh in mind that you can tread on people's toes. But I think we've got to a point now, most of the events are back in 2012, 2013, that we can look at it objectively. And the neat thing about this is it's not just about what happened, it's about how we can leverage some of the practices that were pioneered on a program for Commonwealth Bank of Australia called Kaching, how we can leverage them really in any kind of large business today. And a lot of the stuff that we did back then is pretty far outside of what people think of as agile product management. So I think you'll get an idea about why in just a couple of minutes. So I've got a deck and I'm going to talk to it. I know some people would rather have the hand wavy bit. So if you feel like you're getting deck blind, do please interrupt me and we can just have faces. So if I do a bit of a share screen, where do I have a share screen? There it is. And I'll go like so. And then I'll do like this. Okay. So Kaching is the name of the program we're talking about. I coached Kaching as part of my responsibilities as principal coach and strategist for the transformation of the Commonwealth Bank during the era we're talking about. But I never expected to be involved in this particular program. I got roped in. I had been focusing on treasury and risk in the bank. I was coaching a program called Liquidity, directed by a man named Chris Young, who's now, in addition to being one of the X-Scale Alliance stewards, he's president of the Swiss Agile Association. But while I was doing that, I was also training groups in other parts of the bank. And I trained a delivery group for digital channels. And I spent 2 or 3 days. It was very technically oriented, nothing really to do with business agility. It was XP, CICD, BDD, that sort of stuff. So I really didn't expect to do any more than that. I did say to them, well, you know, would you like me to come and coach? And they said, no, thank you very much. We've got some mature Scrum Masters. And they did. Nick Ho, Leon Tranter, I want to say the other guy's name. It'll come to me. Leon Pinter. Anyway, so the way that they engaged was very much in a traditional agile mode. And so about 3 months in, I had a call from the general manager who owned that group, Rob Webb. And Rob was not happy. He was very unhappy. He asked me to join him in a particular conference room in a building all the way across town within half an hour. And I sprinted over there, got a taxi over there and so on. And I sat down with him and he said, "G'day, my name's Rob. I'm about to stop doing Agile. How are you?" And I said, I'm Pete and I'm very well, but why are you going to do that? And he said, well, I've been talking to the Scrum Masters and as far as I can tell, it's because it does exactly what you said it was going to do. They say that you said that all the dials were going to turn red and we were going to see all the things that are wrong with the program. The business is, in Australian parlance, we'd say ropeable. They're very stressed out. They don't like what's going on and they're blaming us. And unless you can find some way to give me predictability, because we're a bank. We have long lead times. We've got to work with a bunch of partners. We've got to be able to hit our calendar dates. And when I talk to the Scrum Masters, they tell me, well, Agile doesn't do that. We've delivered as much ROI as we possibly could. We did what the product owner told us to do. Well, if that's how Agile works, I have to stop, said Rob. And Rob used to be a developer. He didn't want to stop. I said, well, give me a weekend to think about it. I came back on a Monday morning. I did a lot of hand waving. The problems you can see on the screen at the moment, this is from an internal case study about what happened at that stage and then what happened 3 months later. So we'll see the 3 months later in just a moment. But I came in on the Monday morning and I did this sort of hand wavy thing. And Rob has a really good systems head and he's a very, very good exec. And he looked at this and he went, wow, well, I can sort of see how that would work. Where else in the bank are we doing this? And I said, nowhere, Rob. And he said, well, where else in the world are they doing this? And I said, as far as I know, nowhere, Rob. I came up with this in the bath yesterday. And Rob said, you're telling me that you want me to risk my career on something you came up with in the bath yesterday? Although he didn't say it quite that quietly. And I said, well, I don't know how else to solve the problem, Rob. It really, what the Scrum Master said to you was about right. That's the traditional Agile line. And Rob said, well, I can't do that. I can't do something that's this experimental and risk my career on it. I said, well, then I can't help you. He said, well, actually you can. I won't risk my career. He said, I'll risk yours. If you have faith in this, if you think this can work, I'll give you 3 months to prove it. And I'll fight the fights. I'll support you to the hilt. And if in 3 months it's still in the ditch, I'm going to blame you. I'm going to besmirch your name in this bank and in all banks all around the world. You'll never work in a bank again. Do you believe in it that much? And I said, I think I do. I think it could work. He said, I think it could work too. You've got 3 months. So happily, and the reason I'm presenting this to you now is that it did work, but it was a step into the darkness. It was not so much a leap of faith. It was well-reasoned. The idea was very simple. What we wanted to do was to think about product agility, breadth first. And the neat thing about thinking of it that way is it provides you with the predictability that Rob was looking for, but more to the point, it reduces the cost of change dramatically. And that meant that when we had, let's say, relatively undisciplined product owners, and we certainly had very undisciplined business stakeholders, when change came, which it came regularly, we had ways of dealing with it. So in 3 months, not only did we get an increase in throughput as far as features to market were concerned, but we were able to adapt this approach to the traditional program metrics in the bank. So we went green across the board in the program services group. And that was the first time any program had done that. And we stayed green across the board for the rest of the year. Not only did we over deliver, but we were able to do this with all of the kinds of quality outcomes you would expect from Agile. And when it came to business agility, we were able to account for learning on a program that was purely experimental as far as the bank was concerned. So to give you an idea, in terms of quality outcomes, we were discovering, as you would expect, if you were doing things properly, CI/CD, BDD, all of that stuff, we were discovering all of the things that were wrong with what we were doing as we were going. So we didn't have that terrible race for the line you get in traditional product management. But more to the point, we were able to harness all of the business and design stakeholders in a collaborative, open way, and without having to do giant PI plans. In fact, a lot of the artifacts were very small. A lot of what we did was very simple. And as I show you how we worked, you'll see that that actually the techniques we used really are so simple that anyone can apply them. This is not rocket science. This is actually straightforward. And when we started to get the benefits, not only were we getting plaudits internally from the business end of things and from the executives, but we also were able to win product awards for this program. In the first year, we won a prize for the most innovative banking product. The second year, we won 3 prizes. And then at the end of the first year, end of 2012, we won the Group CIO Award for the best project in the bank. So this is a massive win internally and externally. And almost none of it has to do with Agile in the traditional sense. I mean, we were working Agile DevOps, and we were really trying to make certain we were a model, a steel thread to pull the bank into a different way of working. But most of the wins here came from the way we did product agility. And so that's really what this case study is about. The press announced that the digital channel we'd created was worth 9 billion. And shortly afterwards, it was rebranded the CBA mobile app. And these days has about 7 million customers using it on a daily basis. But the point here is that we did this not as a start off to the side. We did this as a way to change the motivation of the bank. So let's look at some of the how-to, because we only have 40 minutes. And if I spend a lot of time talking about, we got all these awards, who cares? What's more interesting is, well, what's useful about this? So I'm not going to talk about any of the technical end of things. I'm not going to talk about some of the cultural prerequisites, things like leadership as a service and open book management and so on. I want to talk about what we did with the product. So we're going to cover the kinds of artifacts that we used to be able to account for breadth first product agility. And they're not that different to what you would think of normally. We simply apply one of the early XP principles to constructing them, the principle of you aren't going to need it. There's no reason to pull features out of an epic. If we think of the difference between those two, we could say that an epic is a kind of a big, vague thing. It tells you why you are trying to deliver something, or why you're trying to change the world in some way, whose behavior is going to have to change, how their behavior has to change, and what you have to do to cause that change. It's really a motherhood statement, but it's lovely to be able to have that sort of why, who, how, what normal form. We get that from Gojko Adzik's impact mapping. The neat thing about it is that it gives you a frame within which to work. And anyone who tells you, well, I want you to do this and this, and they're outside that frame, you can immediately question those sorts of assertions because you've got this breadth first agreement about, well, we're working in here. And if we keep on doing this iteratively, then we're able to make certain that we can take all of I should probably move this since I'm sharing the screen, you'll probably see. There we go. All of the vagueness about risk and scope and value and so on. We can take that vagueness and we can eliminate it iteratively. So there's no point to pulling features out of epics unless you need to plan a release. So the idea that we have to get everything down to a story level, as you would do if you were doing a PI plan, is just enormously wasteful, and it dramatically increases cost of change. So if we do this when we need to, it changes the game. And if we can do it continuously, then when change comes, it's really easy to adapt to change, to respond to change. And you might think, well, wait a second, responding to change, that's one of the original manifesto values. That's something we expect. You might expect it, but if you look in the state of Agile survey for the last 5 years, you'll find that only about 5% of, this is the largest and longest running survey in the Agile world, only about 5% of Agilists say that Agile has delivered the ability to respond to change. So this idea of being able to adapt breadth first is a big deal. Now, I'm not going to go into very much depth on what the rest of this slide means because we only have 40 minutes. But the point of it is a feature is an atom of releasable stuff. It actually has some concrete business value. Epics are too big and broad to ever say, well, we've released it. There's always more with diminishing returns on it. Scenarios in a BDD sense, they're really about the acceptance criteria for the features, how we go about testing this. And stories are the way we track at a team level. But what we're really trying to do with this is characterize the frame and have a way to do that. So we have a pattern that we use to try and identify a landscape of epics. And this pattern, we call it the pirate canvas, is based on work that came out of an incubator in San Francisco called 500 Startups. I think McClure is the guy's name. I want to say Doug McClure, but that might be the guy from Simpsons. Anyway, the idea with pirate metrics, the reason they're called pirate metrics, is the acronym is R, acquisition, activation, retention, referral, and revenue. Well, we could think of the last one as return, because sometimes it might be about risk reduction. So the reason we have them in this order is you can't, if we think activate is identifying the people that we have acquired at a minimum so that we can bill someone for their behavior. When Google puts a cookie in your browser, that's activation. When you use their search service, maybe they're acquiring you, but if you don't keep their cookie in your browser, they can't sell your eyeballs to the advertisers. There's lots of other things we could explain about these metrics, but basically you can't retain people you haven't activated. You can't get referrals from people you don't retain, and revenue is a function of all of these. So we could think that at any one time, one of these is going to be the constraint. If you are familiar with theory of constraints, there's always one dominant constraint on the growth of a system. And since we're talking about market constraints here, knowing which of these constraints is, so which of these bottlenecks is currently the constraint for the growth of your market, and then reprioritizing continuously to be able to meet that specific constraint. And then when you've opened that constraint, another one of these things will become the constraint, and that'll keep happening. There might be more bottlenecks you want to identify, but these are the basics. These are common to any product growth curve. So the why, who, how, what we talked about before, why we would want to deliver something, whose behavior would have to change, how, and what you'd have to do to cause that change in behavior. But we need to start with something we usually don't start with when it comes to product. When someone turns up with a vision and say, well, we want to be the fastest pizza delivery service on the planet. Yeah, okay. That would only be marketable if pizza delivery sucks in some market segment, in some geographic area. If it doesn't, if there's no negative, if there's no problem to solve, then there's no point to being the fastest or the best. You're basically going to be simply meeting existing basic expectations in a Kano sense. So I'm not going to go into detail about this example, except to say that we use this one for training, and we usually talk about the early days of Uber, back when Uber was something that people wanted to emulate. The idea of this particular canvas is based on Uber in 2008, where they came up with this brainstorm. Hey, we could change the game. The way that the use of small cars rather than buses or trains or private cars, the way that these cars are used for taxi services, that sucks in various different ways, and we could go about solving these. Key to understanding this canvas is to understand that we are using this to question the assumptions that are made by the business. We want to be able to quantify those assumptions. So to pick an example, that last one, if the bottleneck on return is on-road costs, it costs a lot of money to get various kinds of signage attached to a taxi cab, there's more maintenance costs and so on. If we've decided that's our problem, well, then maybe one way we can deal with the problem is to get the industry regulators to not require special insurance for our Uber cars, and we can have some clever legal lobbying workflow to solve that. That last step, the lobbying workflow, that's usually where product guys turn up and say, well, we want something that does this. We need to be able to take it back to why. Because if the why is wrong, then the who is wrong. And the how is wrong, and the what is wrong. So if it turns out that the real problem on return is not on-road costs, but that there's a very effective monorail system, a light rail system in this particular city, if we're talking about Singapore, say, and that's why we're not going to be able to make money in this particular market segment, well, then on-road costs isn't actually the problem. And all the rest of the thinking about what we're going to deliver is nonsense. We're going to miss the mark. So this idea of breadth first is critical. If we were to say, well, actually on-road costs is the problem, but this strategy of lobbying industry regulators, this is fraught with peril. If we are identified as doing this, we can wind up being accused of bribery. Maybe what we should be doing is working collaboratively with insurers. Since we know a lot about the behavior of the drivers, we can tell them which drivers are safe bets, and then we can actually sell the insurance for them, and that'll bring down the costs. So quantifying those assumptions and understanding how to go about building a frame within which there actually is a real market. That's work. And there are a set of release goals that come with these things. This is work that you might go, well, how can we even justify that? We have to do what the business tells us to do. There are answers to how you change the way that you work with business that we're not going to cover today. As I said, things like leadership as a service and Camelot model and open book management, that's not for what we're talking about in this case study. This is a picture of an actual pirate canvas that was built for a startup in Ireland that is working on replacing the way that supermarkets work, because supermarkets kind of break the relationship between producers and consumers, so that you can't, for example, go to a supermarket and get the same quality cherries this week as you got last week, because you have no idea who the farmer was for those cherries. So you'll see this is more complex than what we looked at before, and that's because this has 5 whys attached. And this also has a concept of release goal baked into it. So the idea is for each of these columns, this is a why, who, how, what epic in one of the bottleneck categories we talked about before. The release goals are usually either a RAT, which is to say a riskiest assumption test. If we've got some assumption about the connection between the why and the who, or the who and the how, or whatever, we want to test that. And if we can't test it, then we might wind up spending millions of dollars delivering something that simply doesn't have a market. On Kaching, there was one release where we delivered Kaching for Facebook because of the gut of some of the business stakeholders that Facebook was becoming a very big deal back in 2012, and we must have some interface for this. Kaching was a person-to-person payments app, at least that's where it started. No one wants to tell people on Facebook that they spent $50 on a pair of shoes. Either someone's going to think that's too cheap, or someone's going to think it's too much, but in any case, it's not something you want to share. Kaching for Facebook cost $3 million and made, I think we had 50 users at the end of the day, and almost all of them were the business stakeholders who wanted it. So missing the mark like that, even if you are a big, powerful bank with lots of marketing dollars, is easy to do if you don't question the frame, quantify the assumptions. So RATs are one kind of release goal, and the other kind is simple. It's bottlenecks, or the constraint bottleneck, if you're familiar with Gold RAT. So much for an epic landscape. That's sort of the breadth of what we could possibly do in a particular market. we need to get much more specific. We have to be able to derive features from an epic. Once we've decided this epic is a relevant bottleneck and we've got to find a way through it, and we have to be able to extract features to do that, or we've decided we have to build a RAT, a risk-based assumption test, an experiment, and we need features of the experimental apparatus. Either way, we have to be able to figure out how to describe those features. There's an old technique from extreme programming called CRC coding. Most people, most analysts and architects have forgotten this technique. There's lots of material online about how it works. The key difference in what we're doing is we realized that with this, CRC is kind of like the dramatis personae for a play. Who is it? What are their responsibilities, and who do they have to interact with to be able to achieve those responsibilities? Whether it's a piece of hardware, software, or a class in a program, or whether it's another human being, we can play these relationships out in a narrative sense. And it's a much lighter way to be able to do sort of bottom-up analysis. If everybody at the table already understands the domain very well, and we can basically, everybody role plays a number of these little cards, and as we go, oh, we're going to need an extra card to do this, then we give it to one of the people around the table, and we basically just role play these things. The lovely thing about that is humans have incredibly good memories for narrative. If I ask you about your favorite movie that you haven't seen for 5 years, you pick a movie. If I ask you what happened, you can tell me, even though you haven't seen it for 5 years. If I show you some clever UML diagram and ask you to explain it, even if you wrote the diagram 6 weeks ago, you won't be able to. You won't be able to reproduce it from memory. So the narrative memory this plays on is really, really useful. I'm not going to get into any more detail about CRC coding, except to say that if you don't understand it, do go and look it up, because it's incredibly useful for any of the kinds of analysis and design conversations that you would like to be able to account for without having to write a lot of things down. But sometimes the people around the table don't see eye to eye. Sometimes they have different kinds of expertise. Sometimes they don't have a clear understanding of each other's frame of reference. And that's where this behavior mapping technique comes in. There's plenty of articles I've written on online on this too, but I haven't really talked about how we used it on Kaching. So with Kaching, a lot of the difficulty came with, there was a lot of re-architecture going on in the bank. There were players in social banking that we needed to bring to the table as well. And there were third-party designers too. So people with very different frames for what kinds of features we would need to be able to satisfy a particular release goal for a particular epic. The neat thing with this is we go, okay, there's a simple way, which I'm not going to go into now, to generate a starter set of features. It's not everything, it's just a starter set. And we do with this then is we build a little matrix of the features against the categories of acceptance criteria. We call these themes, which is repurposing an old Scrum word, but it actually means the same thing. A theme is a collection of epics, or at least of the features within an epic. And so the idea is we look at these as cross-cutting. And so your themes could be personas, they could be architectural components, non-functional qualities, whatever. What we do with this is we use just a few themes. We use these as a way to understand the acceptance criteria to the point that people can agree with each other. So we don't need to actually write those acceptance criteria down, or design criteria if you like. We simply need to get people to go, yes, yes, there is a particular testable acceptance criteria in this category for this feature. If they can agree that much, then their frames come into alignment and they can actually start to collaborate on estimates of value and estimates of budget for features. And you might go, wait a second. Estimates, we do no estimates. No estimates is fine at a story level. But at the end of the day, if we don't estimate budgets, somebody's going to. It's not that they're just going to keep on handing us money for nothing. So we needed a way to be able to have those conversations without having misaligned frames. And this technique got people to the point where even where they were not well enough aligned to agree on a bottom-up analysis of what had to be done, they got into alignment top-down. The other beautiful thing about it is that we use the themes as lenses to question whether we have actually got all the features we need for a particular release goal. So I'm not going to go into any more detail on that one. Now I'm trying to give you a breadth-first view of the things that we did for breadth-first product agility. But here's an example of one of these behavior maps. This one was one for that Irish startup. And the idea here was to understand the specific themes were relevant for the pirate canvas we were looking at before, or for one of the epics in there. So we basically have one of these for each. That sounds like a lot of work if you have a lot of themes, and it is. Most of the time, if people are well aligned, much easier to do CRC. This is for those cases where people start having fights because they don't agree on context. So, all right, now we've got a set of features for each of our epics, or each of the epics that is currently a constraint. We don't need to build lists of features for the ones that aren't currently market constraints. And there's usually just one constraint, but sometimes you have more than one, depending on the markets you're talking about. So the point is, we don't need to build out vast arrays of these things. We're trying to refine specific selections, specific epics from our epic landscape, specific features from a single epic. We don't want to do any more than that. We don't certainly want to be breaking stories and acceptance criteria out of things that we are not about to work on and release, because it increases the cost of change. It makes it very difficult for us to manage a lot of different artifacts at once. What we want is just a few artifacts. And you're going to see that in the final pattern here, which we call 3D Kanban, but we'll get to that. So we need to get budgets and priorities for these features. How do we go about doing this? Very simple technique. Lots of text on the screen, but I'm going to give you the hand wavy bit for that. So we have a big layout of Fibonacci numbers. We use Fibonacci numbers. You add the first, each numbers, you add them to get the next number. We use those because, for no other reason than that, they tend to make people fight. And if people fight, then we can get better decisions. We have a simple protocol called leadership as a service for resolving those fights. So we have to get some empirical probes to use to measure against, some candlesticks that will tell us how relatively big and small things are. And so what we are going to want is two kinds of candlestick, and we call them the three bears. Because if you remember the Goldilocks story, there's a little one and a medium size one, a baby bear, a mama bear, and a papa bear. So if we're talking about budget, then we'll pick three features from something that most of the people involved are familiar with. One that was little, and we can actually go back to our JIRA logs or back to our timesheeting system and find out exactly how much work went into that little one. Let's say that it was 3 days or 3 team days. The papa bear might be 20 times that size at 55 here, and the mama bear might be sort of in the middle, about 13. It's most features cost around about what the mama bear. If we just had to guess about a feature, we'd guess that mama bear number. Obviously, we don't want to be guessing, but we have to start somewhere. So we're going to get two kinds of estimate for each of our features. And the way we're going to get those estimates is we're going to compare them with the three bears. Well, actually, we'll have 3 bears for business value and 3 bears for budget, because those two things are not equivalent. And what we want is to have a number for business value and a number for budget, because when we have those two numbers, we can do an ROI calculation. It's going to be a relative ROI calculation, because the business guys are never willing to go, oh, this Kaching for Facebook is going to make $50 million or get 500,000 users or whatever it is. They're not willing to do that because they'll get blamed for it. but they are willing to say, well, this is more important than that, and here's why. And that's really all we need to get when it comes to these numbers. So the way we get the rest of the estimates is simply by comparing with those three and comparing each feature with all of the other features that are on the table. And so there's quite a lot of swapping back and forth until people go, well, that looks about right to me. So it's quite different to planning poker in that you're not peeping through a keyhole and trying to get some estimate on a card. You're trying to get things to be relatively right so that you can actually coordinate their relationship to reality. When you learn more, it's going to tell you things that you can use about how much the whole thing costs. And part of the way we were able to hit the numbers in the program services group was to say, okay, we're making commitments at a feature level. If, for a particular date, if it turns out that we're pressed, we can return to this process and the one we're about to see, release refactoring, and we can adjust those commitments. We're not going to spend any more money. We're simply trying to get the most ROI, the most product market impact, the most business throughput. So, so this is a re-enterable, lightweight process. This is not about saying, oh, once every 3 months, we're going to do this. We will do this whenever the business or the technologists or the designers go, we just learned something and it's going to be important. We have to go back and agree on the numbers in the light of new data. And you might go, wait a second, that big business can't do that. Well, we did. And we were able to win the prize for best program in the bank. This actually works. I'm not just making stuff up. So the way we were able to do this also won all those product awards and produced this big, beautiful win in a business sense. And that was because we hit the market. So this is basically balancing. It's walking the fine line between commitment and adaptation. You have to be able to do both. So after we've got numbers for budget, we'll pick 3 different bears. The baby bear here is something that was it was a bell or a whistle. It didn't get us an awful, it was Kaching for Facebook, if you like. It didn't get us a lot of return. The popper bear is something where, well, if the system didn't do that, people wouldn't use it at all. With Kaching, there was one use case where if you bumped your phones together, $5 would jump from one phone to the other. That was really good for Australia, where people like to buy each other beers. So that was a big part of the marketing campaign. It was a big part of why we went off big to begin with, because no one ever thought a banking app would do anything like that. And then the mama bear would be something where, well, it's in the top 80% of features. We could do without it, but we don't want to. And obviously, it's sort of a bit like Moscow, but it's more precise because we're really interested in the relative numbers we can get out of this. And so then what we want to do, once we've got the business value numbers and the budget numbers, we want to do an ROI calculation. I'm not going to explain why we use this particular formula for ROI, except to say that this is relative ROI because the business value numbers are only relative. And so we have to do a little bit of a dance to be able to avoid a couple of unpleasant circumstances. One of the unpleasantnesses is, well, by this calculation, if we have a naive calculation, just value minus budget divided by budget, well, it might turn out that the value number, since it is not the same basis as the budget number, we get a negative ROI out. It's not really a negative ROI, it's just a negative relative ROI. So we have to deal with that. And we need to be able to play these things so they have a non-linear relationship so we can get good prioritization out. So you can probably come up with a better ROI calculation than that. We haven't been able to, but we'd be all ears if you could. So that's great, but ROI isn't enough. It's what we want first. We can list all these features in order of descending ROI. But then we want people in the room, technical and business, to tell us that's wrong. There's a problem with that. We've promised such and such a feature to this external party or this person with a big loud tie. And if we don't deliver that, then we're not going to be able to follow through on our commitments. There's a cost of delay attached to it. Or there's a technical dependency that it causes a cost of delay. So what we do is we get the stakeholders in the room to argue with that prioritization, to adjust it by discrete cost of delay. This is not some WSJF fudge factor. This is not statistically smeared of a bunch of things. We're actually making intelligent, informed, conversational decisions about why one thing would have to come before another. And we've already got a prioritization to base it on. And we've made ROI an explicit number, which we're about to use. So that's great for quantifying the features in an epic. What happens when you've got a lot of epics on the table? This is a picture, it's vectorized, but it's an actual picture from the first time we used a particular practice called release refactoring on Kaching. And the reason we had to invent this was that the business guys could not agree with each other on what was the most important thing to do. And they were pulling the technical guys into meeting after meeting after meeting, taking them away from delivery work. So we needed a way to get these reprioritization decisions to happen quickly and breadth first. And what we came up with was so simple that we took conversations that were taking on the order of 6 weeks per 3-month release. Obviously, we wanted to do continuous delivery, but those lead times that Rob was telling me about at the start, that was to do with commitments, and that's what we had to respect. There are ways to do this that are continuous delivery, continuous analysis as well. We'll touch on that hopefully before we finish. So, so they were taking 6 weeks. That conversation, the first time we applied this, that conversation collapsed to 2 hours. And once that conversation was sorted out, we had put ring fences, numerical ring fences around the decision-making to the point that there simply was no dithering to do. So how do we do this? Well, each of these columns on the table, there were 2,200, I'm going to call them feature points. It was really a characterization of the amount of full-time employee days that were available to us for the next release. So we only had 950 feature points that we could, or FTE days, depends on how you want to deal with your budget, or team weeks, whatever. There are only 950 available to us, and there were 2,200 points of work on the table. How do you make these decisions without having a punch up? What we did was we said, okay, we're going to list these features in each of these epics that are important to these business guys. We're going to list them in order of decreasing ROI. Now, this is immediately violating the breadth first idea that I talked about before, because we already knew which of these were relevant to the current market constraint, which were not. But we didn't have the business guys that far along. So we have these in order of descending, not just ROI, descending ROI plus, well, relative ROI plus discrete cost of delay. I'm just going to call that descending priority order for now. Okay, so the idea here is this is a Kanban. So we, hang on, I'll go back. So we're pulling the work to the right. We want to minimize work in progress. And the rightmost column here is work that has already been through system integration testing. We've done our blue-green testing and our alpha and our beta and our A/B testing. If we're doing continuous delivery, this is stuff that's integrated into our product, but we haven't necessarily got the product analytics hooked up to it that we need to be able to make informed decisions on our pirate canvas. So there's a flow of information that comes from this right column that goes to the left. We're pulling the work to the right, and we are pulling the information to the left. So the stuff that's going into that sort of data science column, this is stuff that's been moved into system integration testing, and that's where we would do that proper testing flow that presumes that we have a good test authoring flow in the rest of what we're doing, BDD, TDD, outside in, red, green, refactor, all of that stuff. If you don't know what those words mean, go and Google them. This column, but again, there's information flowing to the left. So the work that we're doing here, because it involves A/B testing, as well as the other kinds of testing, that's informing our analysis of, well, have we opened the constraint? Are we actually ready to say, well, now we can reprioritize? Or maybe the constraint hasn't moved. Maybe our features didn't actually open it. So since we're talking about market constraints. So, so basically that information is vitally important for making those. This is really where we get experimentation going The next column to the left is, and again, we remember we're pulling the work. So it's not about getting lots and lots of these things happening at once. We want as little happening at once as possible. So we just want to get it done. So if we've got run out of work to do on these columns, then feature integration testing, we've got new features that have been built, but we haven't authored tests against production-like environments. We've got a bunch of canned data in CI and we're building tests against those. That's great. We want to take that BDD test, the acceptance criteria, and show how we can test them in production. That's what we do in this feature integration testing environment. And then the stuff in the middle, and that influences our estimates of how much work we have to do to actually get things over the line, and the business value of the work. Then in the middle, we've got basically a bunch of teams, and each of these teams is working on a single feature at a time. And this is where the slicing thing comes in, because they don't need to worry about a huge product backlog of stories. They're only interested in the stories they want to pull out of the feature they are trying to get over the line, they're trying to get to market. So the beautiful thing for them is that they have a small number of tests to author first. They're going to do this test driven, and a small number of stories in flight. Really, to do really quite a large program, we only need a dozen, maybe a couple of dozen cards on this wall to be able to do this. We don't need vast walls full of stories and lots of red string of dependencies, because yes, there are dependencies, but there are only a few relevant ones at a time, because those dependencies are turning up at this story level, and there's only a few stories in flight at any one time. So design, test, build, and continuous integration, if we assume that refactoring is going on there as a discipline, not as something that in a safe context you plan, no, this is something we do all the time mercilessly, then the tests that are coming out will inform the rest of the process. That's basically it.